To see you all in the room right now, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Orit Halpern today to our Public Life series through the Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities. Orit is joining us from Dresden, where she is the chair of the Digital Cultures Program and Center, and she's also professor of digital cultures at the Technical University of Dresden. She has had visiting positions at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, at IKKM in Weimar, and at Duke University, amongst other places. Her research looks at the histories of science, computing, and cybernetics, but it does so in terms of its interactions with economics, governance, social transformation, the environment, design, past and present. Much of it circling around the second part of the 20th century and what we think of as the historical Cold War, which I also think of as the long Cold War. Her first book was with Duke University Press. Unfortunately, my copy is in my office where I am not. It is entitled Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason, and it explores the intersections of big data, design, cybernetics, and governmentality in the past. I mean, in the past, that moment with the post-World War II era and into the present. Her recent book, The Smartness Mandate, which I also have right here, which was co-authored by Robert Mitchell, excellent book, continues some of these threads, and it traces certain presentist preoccupations, one of them being smart technologies, the other being AI. And she does this they do this by examining the Cold War emphasis on homeostasis in relation to a simultaneous strand of neoliberal engagement with stochastic processes and trying to leverage those to figure out how these systems interact and can be perhaps reconciled or not. Her current research projects include one on the history of automation, intelligence, and freedom, and another on histories of experimentation at the planetary scale in design, science, and engineering. And of course, I would imagine the two very neatly interact with one another and speak across one another. So with that, Orit, welcome to the event. Very nice to have you here.
A pleasure. Thank you so much, Ryan, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, great. I'd like to start with something that's unfair for everybody else that's in the room, because it's a chapter that you have written, which is yet to be published, but will be in the not too distant future, I hope. And the reason I want to look at it is because, kind of tracing your own work, looking at something very present and maybe making some links back to your earlier work. And the title of this chapter is called The Neural Imaginary, the Cold War, AI, and Neoliberal Economies. Now, the title indicates multiple areas of interest that you have, that you've previously addressed. These include models of the mind or models of the brain, how they operate, sensory perception, ways in which historioeconomic contexts influence, emerge, and change how we understand these models of the brain, and how our imaginaries interact with and engage technology and vice versa. So, not necessarily wanting you to trace that chapter, but maybe to pull out some of the key words and explore what you think is driving this complex layer that also emerges as the neural network in your analyses, and how that is at play in the contemporary moment.
Yeah, well, just to give people a little bit of a framework about what we're talking about. So for starters, for many of us think about neural nets or deep learning or these kind of technologies and technical practices, we think really immediate. We think maybe 2014, attention is all you need, papers on transformer architecture, or maybe we think about the advent of generative adversarial networks and these kind of things, all of them basically in the first decades of the 2000s. But of course, for anybody thinking in a longer history, the first neural network, of course, the idea of the neural network was first spawned in 1943 by two people, McCullough and Pitts, so Warren McCullough and Walter Pitts, a kind of mathematical prodigy and actually a psychiatrist, kind of working in conversation with a lot of people who, basically are known or kind of have been ordained problematically so as sort of kind of the originary sites for contemporary digital computing. If anybody thinks about the present, we also tend to think about economy, startups, fast money, Anderson Horowitz, move fast, break things, spend lots of money, destroy stuff, rabid technophilia, and a sort of kind of extremely potent idea of kind of extreme speculation done by tech bros. One of the things that this article is trying to show is that relationship between the kind of startup economy of Silicon Valley and of our contemporary information age is actually kind of infrastructurally hardwired into our machinery, and that it comes from a longer history of how we've imagined economy, human decision-making, and of course, intelligence, particularly in machines. And so what the paper tries to do is to actually articulate the fact that, it's not just in the first dot-com boom or, in 2008 or when have you, that this sort of modes of financialized speculation, but that the financial speculation and the structure of the technology are inseparable. And then that has real deep political and ethical implications for us, right? And so what I do is I track the emergence and the convergence of three models. The model of the neural net coming out of cybernetics and computing, the model of in psychology of what we've called Hebbian networks, which is ideas of neuroplasticity, and the fact that our brains are actually comprise, that we don't store memory, like we don't store, a database of every image or every face or everything we've ever seen. We actually store patterns. When a certain set of stimuli hit our eyes or what have you, and get transferred to the brain, a certain group of neurons get trained and conditioned to respond together. It's a famous adage, neurons are kind of cells that fire together, wire together. And this idea of a brain that kind of mimes this kind of machine idea of the idea that the neuron is actually a logic gate. It makes yes, no, on, off, fire, don't fire decisions. Also converged at the same time with the emergence of a kind of critique of the Keynesian state, and also a critique of both fascism and communism, started by individuals like Hayek and Friedman. And what those people wanted to imagine is they wanted to imagine systems of self-organizing without planning and without, state direction. And so their model, they had to create an idea of decision-making, economic decision-making for human beings that fit with the idea that small little decisions networked together might make better decisions than any of us could do individually. And they had to re-envision the market essentially as a network of basically decisions being made by individuals who themselves are kind of a little bit like psychotic patients or neurons, not really fully conscious of everything that's going on, people with incomplete information, not making making decisions in ways in deeply subjective ways, but that at scale, those decisions could be agglomerated in order to optimize for whatever it is you want to optimize, in their case, usually for price or money. But these ideas, and of course there's other things like game theory and that also talked about optimizing kind of not necessarily great decisions, that all began to view the human as a sort of, and the machine as compatible. And my argument is that the neural net allowed people to move from the object of the cell inside your brain to this level of the subject, to the very level or scale of, say, the society, if we think about a market as kind of a scalar entity. And so that's just to lay out sort of what the kind of argument is, but the point is to think about how those previous earlier eras and inventions that happened in the 40s and 50s really start to become realized technologies and policies and ideas starting with the 70s. And then, to really think about, hey, some of the things that we take as just assumed as natural, that, we can't plan markets, that that we need speculative capital to have technology improve, that these things are deeply historically embedded and situated and have political repercussions, that most particularly in this paper I'm concerned with are questions of things like civil rights, that these theories of self-organizing systems and self-organizing brains and kind of autonomous decision-making without consciousness all emerged at the same time, that certain marginalized or disenfranchised groups in the United States are actually lobbying for activist government intervention in actually, things like, affirmative action to allow more Blacks or women into, or queers into institutions, actually kind of confirming the question of consciousness and agency for groups that had previously not been enfranchised by liberal political orders. So, that's the critical question. Sort of how do these models intersect with those political kind of movements and challenges to incorporation that these sort of neoliberal ideas often found themselves allied against, that they're like, and the basic question is, yeah, why do all these tech bros make such company with the alt-right? I mean, let's just be simple. So this all sounded very complicated way to get to a fairly recent question, but to say that that's not automatic, but it is, it may also be ingrained infrastructurally, that it's not just particular tech bros seem to like right-wing politics. It's that there's actually logics embedded inside our technical systems.
Yeah, I think it, I mean, obviously there's a lot there to begin to tease out. And one of the things that I find particularly compelling is this kind of ancient allure of the digital, this belief in small units of storable information, whether it's the letter or the number, whatever, and the way that kind of translates onto notions of the micro as having the possibility to scale up and influence at different levels of scale other phenomena in which it is a part. So it's a way to kind of get a hold of and control very dynamic systems, at least for a very short period of time. And I'm wondering if one way to begin to bring in some further context for this, some ways of unpacking this, is to take some of the dramatis personae that you invoke in this and think them through. So, for example, Hayek as a really pivotal figure in this regard, having worked on a book on the senses and about perception, which is very much in the wheelhouse of the Macy conferences, which was almost exclusively about that, with Wiener kind of hanging around the edges and Shannon hanging around the edges, and yet emerging as kind of the main ones. But McCullough's right in the mix with that as well. So I'm wondering, do you want to talk a little bit about Hayek and his position and his thinking that pulls together both this concern with what is it, The Road to Serfdom? That's the title of one of his books, right?
Right.
And that fear of state control and also a fear of the mob, how that coalesces into the agency of the individual being kind of elevated in a certain way, but it's not the individual qua individual, it's individual yet as an aggregate.
Right.
And that leads to that point that you discuss about economic equity not being necessarily correlated with legal equity.
Yeah, so you ask a bunch of amazing questions. So first I want to emphasize that nothing is determined, like I'm not into
Yeah.
causal history, so the question is how a lot of different things layered upon each other to assemble together to create
Uh-huh.
a kind of redefinition of individual freedom, the individual and individual freedom as the unit, the most central and important unit to which I guess society should serve. But at the same time, that those ideas of freedom, they're not Martin Luther King's idea of freedom. I mean, there's a lot of freedoms going on, during the Cold War, and it's very important to situate this within a broader
Yes.
discussion, of capitalism and freedom, of a vision of kind of a Christian and religious kind of West, and a capitalist one fighting this communist side, and that what differed them was kind of this elevation of individuals as free, but different groups tried to envision what that freedom might mean.
Yeah.
Sometimes all of them thinking about it collectively, but it's sort of what collectivity and what value systems surrounded that collectivity. So one could say, in many ways, people understood that there's power in collective action, even as they sought to enfranchise individuals as, for lack of a better way, liberal enlightenment, to be given these freedoms to be able to exercise, to be able to realize their full potential, supposedly as humans. So there's a discourse of freedom attached to a discourse of becoming, or best incorporated in those pictures you see from the Civil War, like, I am a man, or actually people claiming this right, if we will, or this possibility, not a right, really a possibility. And then there's this other vision of freedom that starts to be about market decision making, which in many ways is a much more reduced idea, even though it comes through a discourse about evading serfdom. And it's not a 100% thing, because someone like Hayek, for example, is really, really interesting because he's confused.
Yes.
Kind of, or he's sitting in between multiple epistemologies. So on one hand, he's incredibly anti-communist, and this is an era of Stalinism, and anti-fascist, and he views that both of those orders as extremely antagonistic to human freedom. And part of that is and he envisions this around, and he comes out of out of Red Vienna, out of a certain milieu of kind of really economic crisis, and sometimes the misdirection of directed planning. But I also don't want to excuse him. I think he's not invested in, women or Black people or anything like this. And I think he's kind of putting forth a vision that he's trying to waver between trying to redefine freedom by redefining the human subject. And the first move he makes is to say human beings are bounded in their knowledge. They're imperfect, they're bad decision makers, and everything comes from there.
Yes.
Once you decide, okay, human beings are limited in their decision-making capacity in terms of making good, whatever that might mean, but in terms of making objective, well-reasoned decisions. people are amenable to fear, to affect, to hate. They're also amenable to fake news, to falsity. So alone, human beings make bad decisions. So then the idea is, okay, if human beings make bad decisions, maybe human beings making decisions at scale can make better decisions. And so that's kind of one of the things he kind of puts forth. But I guess initially for Hayek, so it's really important to realize he rests on this idea of subjectivity.
Yes.
And he then transforms freedom away from, and there's so many, I can't go through every definition of freedom that anyone has ever had. It would be huge, and maybe you know better than me, actually. But I can say within like Demolieu, he moves away from freedom as like a civil right, or to really to this question of being allowed to decide, to enter markets, and to be a practitioner, to be able to engage in market activity, as an evaluation of that, and that the state's only role becomes, and the law is still important for him, actually, and that's the one place that kind of doesn't sit within the technological thing. The law, like the job of the state is solely to guarantee the existence of the market that each of us and the ability to participate in it. Now, how you understand that goes up and down and all sorts of things. And the way people have chosen to understand it is in very limited ways, right?
Yeah.
They have. So I don't know if that's sort of where you're going, but basically he has this very complex thing. But the issue is that he's critiquing Keynesianism, he's critiquing all this stuff. And then, pretty much a couple years after the war, the big collapse that all these Mont Pelerin guys were expecting, that the UK and the US would just dissolve in a morass of bad decision making, didn't happen. People were like, they were affluent, they were fine, like maybe, neo-colonial and extracting and doing other bad things, but that wasn't Hayek's concern. He wasn't really about equity or redistribution. That he's just got this individual unit and maintaining its ability to act. And the more things don't go well for neoliberalism, the more that at the time, which is unthinkable now, the more that he starts to fall on these languages of biology and cybernetics and systems to begin to kind of put almost, if we will, naturalize what is pretty much at one point, clearly a social and political question. How do societies want to organize themselves? Now takes on a veneer of a natural imperative that human beings are this way, that we have to do this, or that, and that imperative comes out when he starts writing things about the organization of the senses, because there you're starting to create a model of the brain that mirrors the kind of agent you imagine in the free market of your fantasy. And so you're seeing a convergence happen, and that's very dangerous. And I think it continues to inhere inside all our contemporary discussions about technology, is that we start to collapse, and this is maybe part of this phenomena called the Anthropocene, which is you start to collapse biological determinism with technological determinism with very little difference. And that's why, people talk about AI, it's not we have to adopt AI, you have to survive, like that kind of discussion starts to take over. But I think there's actually a very specific nature that's imagined here, and it's the nature of these networks of self-organizing systems that are never planned consciously by anyone, and just somehow optimize energy or resources or money. That's kind of badly specified. How that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of an autonomous element to it, right? And looking at auto and nomos, right? It's self-governing, and so it's got this. It will emerge regardless, and that the best thing to do is kind of get out of its way and let certain things collapse, fall, burn, change, evolve, whatever. Before I carry on, because I wasn't really going in any direction, I'm just evoking
Okay.
things. But before I carry on with my next kind of intervention, I just wanted to tell people who are here that Orit and I will talk for about another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A so that all of you can engage with the issues that Orit is raising here. So because this might be kind of the last one that I get to pose to you, I'm wondering how the models of the brain, models of the mind that emerge, say from Piaget and child development into, I mean, influence AI through Minsky and some other people, but also how models of the mind that emerge from Hebb, as you mentioned, and other sources begin to influence legacies of neoliberal imaginaries, and how that begins to position, sort of where you ended, how that begins to position what sorts of things we can do to think of and construct and imagine civic society.
Well, these are excellent questions. So for starters, I want to say that I'm not a Piaget expert at all.
Fair enough.
So I can't, but of
No, you don't
course
have to go there.
there's,
I'm just saying, yeah, that was just one of many out there. Yeah,
so first I want to say at any moment in time, there are multiple and competing
absolutely.
models.
Yeah.
And not only that, the inevitability of their convergence is not pre-given.
No.
Of the neoliberals, I haven't gone far enough yet. I mean, this is also part of a new project, so I still have to look like, does anyone else mention Hebb? Well, I happen to know that people like Fisher Black do.
Yes.
But, later on in finance, and I guess this comes back to a really interesting thing you said. I really liked your framing, which is that this is that part of my big concern in historicizing or creating genealogies, should I say, because it's not causal, of AI and smartness, has been about thinking about the neoliberal engagement with stochastic and processes and probability versus kind of ideas of balance and order and things like that. And one of the things that I would say is that, some of these in the late 70s and 80s, a bunch of people came out of other fields. Somebody like Fisher Black, who's one of the producers of the Black-Scholes derivative pricing equation for options pricing. And these are kind of the founders, obviously there's many founders, but credited of a contemporary finance, and particularly computationally, underpinned finance, came out of being trained in applied mathematics, for example. They weren't economists.
No.
They were. He actually had Minsky on his committee, and these people were also deeply engaged, and they did have engagements with Hicks thinking, although Hayek was really a theorist. But it populated ideas where people really were importing ideas from the physical sciences and life sciences into economic ideas, in following with the cybernetics concept. So in many ways, what those people, so for Hayek in particular, Hebb was actually directly mentioned. He was part of his model of mind and part of his later kind of ideas that come more like in the later 60s and 70s, not the early kind of probably what most people know. But I think more broadly, Hebb is considered, he was a huge influence. And he was a huge influence on early neural network producers like Rosenblatt. What he wasn't popular with, there was kind of a split between neuroplasticity and all this stuff, and these people like Minsky and Chomsky and et cetera, trying to figure out the genetic grammar of language. And that's where AI went for a while, to be honest. So in many ways, this is like a latent history that was sitting there that kind of got stopped somewhere in like the 60s and then suddenly made this enormous resurrection in the 90s because of like Canadian funding, where people brought back these models. But in economics, the idea of the self-organizing system was incredibly important. And I think there was always a problem there about learning, which was
Yes.
to say, how do systems learn? How do markets
Right.
learn? How do they adapt information? And what was interesting is that, you know, there's Lawrence Summers working on noise
Mhm.
trading, there's Fisher Black. So a lot of people know that markets can have a lot of bad data in them and fake news, and that actually people make decisions on that. In fact, this is a feature of the market. What I try to figure out is when did that stop being a problem and start being an
An
opportunity for
opportunity.
arbitrage? You know, so for a while, people were kind of concerned, like, you know, babies seem to make better decisions than markets. They seem to be able to learn
Yeah.
from their mistakes. And we keep,
We hope. Or they die.
or they die, or bad
Yeah.
things happen. But
Yeah.
you know, there seems to be at an individual level this elastic question of adaptation. And, you know, one of the issues that vex neoliberals and leads to a lot of paranoia is sort of like, if the market's doing something, do we know if it's being manipulated, or do we know if that's just markets self-organizing into patterns, you know, which they're supposed to do? So there's always this question of like, is it the invisible hand? Is it the deep state manipulating everything, or is it that? And the real problem there is, yeah, how do systems learn? And how do you know if they're learning correctly? You know, are they taking the right information and responding to it right, whatever that is? So you have so many open problems there that really become an issue. And what some of these guys start doing in the 80s and 90s is they start actually saying, we know that there's fake news, we can actually make money off of it.
Yes.
Like,
Right.
we can arbitrage this problem in our options equations and stuff like that. So what was a problem, you know, for a particular era, if we will, of thinkers, has became instead just a pure
An
speculative
opportunity.
problem.
Yeah.
But furthermore, I think it's a problem in our contemporary AI systems, you know,
Yeah.
and social networks. If truth is, you know, where the money moves, or just how many people click I love it, then, you know, that's what it, you know, as far, there's no place in the model of the neural network, whether in Hicks neural network idea of a self-organizing market, or sometimes even in Hebbian. I mean, people have a lot of problems knowing how brains correct
Yes.
errors.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're not very good at figuring it out. So, because obviously we continue to, you know, many of us suffer all sorts of things, and it's not that easy to just solve these perhaps the forms of pain or what have you that we suffer. So that issue of kind of managing learning and what learning constitutes, I think, is a fundamental debate, and it's not one that's answered. But it's not just a scientific problem or a technological
No.
problem. It's of course a political and socio-economic question, because we decide through assigning value, through deciding what forms of speculation we privilege,
Right.
what we think will be considered right or true or what have you. So
Or
and
important.
this or important. And the same thing, of course, when you train a net. I mean, nets are
That's right.
infinitely known for model collapse, for getting over under trained, for finding fake, hallucinating, which is finding basically kind of fake patterns or ecological falsity out of large data sets. So, you know, our machines are just as amenable to
True.
all these problems.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, part of this too is the lack of capacity for time, memory, forgetting, and historical consciousness to,
Right. No,
to have
there's none of that.
no, there's none of that in there. And that all of that gets bracketed in a way that allows it to do certain things, but absolutely prevents it from doing other things that we might wish it to do. And again, that's the ascription of value. It's an aesthetic judgment. It's taking the aestheses of the world and making an aesthetic judgment about it and ascribing it value and saying this is more valuable than something else. And that's the position that we're in. I mean, there are a lot of different ways we could go with this, and I would love to continue, but I think even though I would like to hog up the whole time because I so enjoy talking to you, I would like to open it up to others. So let me see if there's anything in the chat. And if you have any questions, please just pop them into the chat. And if you don't, I abhor a vacuum as much as nature does. So I will I will fill it. I will fill it almost immediately. In fact, I will go ahead and do so. One of the things that you and I mentioned very briefly when we were sending some emails back and forth was civil rights as an alternative imaginary for building knowledge. And I was wondering if you might want to just wax speculative about that just a little bit.
Well, there's so many places. Again, I'm
Absolutely.
just starting this project, and I don't. This is kind of like the kind of things I throw out, and so people can like think about this. And I wouldn't just put civil rights. You know, it could be. There's many other social movements that are worth thinking about. But civil rights are unique. Obviously, not just insisting on human rights or this kind of base idea of human in the sense of people staying alive or what have you, but is about political enfranchisement into institutions. And I think that, you know, one of the things that the fantasy of having a lot of small, like, imagine the model, it's like, just like a silicon chip has like small little logic gates. You know, McCullough and Pitts decide, you know, that's what our brain does, that each neuron is just firing on or off. It's just like a logic gate. It's just making this little minute, not necessarily conscious decision. And that a lot of these little minute, not necessarily conscious, certainly not necessarily brilliant decisions can agglomerate into really complex systems. And there's something super, and they just do this, right? This is very attractive evolutionary model, just like life just kind of emerges out of this stuff. It's also highly improbable, right? Because somehow entropy is defeated. But this idea kind of runs absolutely counter to the idea of individuals being given the right to make democratic decisions as a group or alone, and to have to actually be conscious about those decisions and to be given the opportunity to become conscious. That's why we battle for education. That's why we battle for the, you know, healthcare. The infrastructure is necessary to allow people to have some concept of not just of sovereignty and maybe autonomy. Like, and I'm not going to valorize those things, because one of the things that's interesting about going through things like civil rights or other movements is the fact that we come to understand, of course, that I don't know who I am if I'm not in relationship with you or this crowd or whatever, that we know that our subjectivities are relational and that they're deeply historically subjective, and but you know, we stand also on questions of representation, of language, of translation, of being able to tell stories and produce meaning. These are all things absent from the models of market and of intelligence that are put forth through the imaginary of the neural network. So I think that's I think why these other groups had ideas. And not only that, they had ideas about, this problem, which they also had to battle in media landscapes,
Yep.
and I'm a media studies person, to get, political support and incorporation without identification. Like, how do you get people who don't think they're exactly you, aren't
Yes.
members of aren't your friends on the social network, aren't like you, to affiliate or to at least support, people that you supposedly have no direct affective or subjective or identificatory relation, and that poses this other question, which is which I don't have time, I don't think, to get into today, which is kind of the complex relationship to diversity
Right.
in both computing and neoliberalism, in the sense of what it means to live with, in diverse polities where we actually all don't agree and aren't all the same, right? And these are really big problems for pattern seeking systems that are looking for similarities, right? And
Mhm.
homophily, to use Wendy Chun's um, idea. So
I mean,
that's just the front.
what's interesting is that it is looking for patterns of similarity, but these are predicated upon patterns of difference. And
Of
it's
course.
making decisions about where those reside and which it's that Bateson quote, the division of the perceived universe into parts and wholes is a useful and perhaps necessary tool for human cognition, but no necessity determines the division. We find the division that is a difference that makes a difference, and within that resides all the difference in the world. And so that is one of the things that is an historical antecedent, just thinking about classificatory systems that run throughout how machine learning and AI gets generated and how it gets built in. And this is where I think your work is so very important. I mean, it chimes very nicely with Kate Crawford's work, but in a different tenor, a different register. And that is looking at these histories of intelligence, looking at these models, looking at how all of this haunts the present, but isn't understood as already predisposing certain modes of replication for the generation of the same when they think it's new and it's innovative.
Yeah. I mean, I can only agree with that. And also perhaps, hold on, someone just
Yeah, Peter
at
asked a
the
question. Yeah.
question. But I think there's also but there is always these production of differentials and differences. I guess we can discuss what difference does difference make, in the sense of, certainly at an institutional and organizational level, many of these technologies, as well as these political economic ideologies, work together to actually, extract value out of
Yes.
difference. It's precisely that workers don't all get paid the same everywhere, and it's exactly that things don't, it's differentials that are central to the logic and value production here. And so, getting into how those differences are both technically and ideologically produced, and the kind of feedback loops in contemporary systems is really important, but it's also critical to understand how they overlay, right, older histories of the Cold War, of coloniality, of race, sex, gender. But to look at this, to what extent do you think these neural networks and self-optimizing digital systems are constrained by the forms of mathematical logic they use, Boolean systems, for instance? My impression is that mathematics today is far more complex than these logic emulators can encompass, let alone the time, memory, history, and social interaction you both mentioned. Thank you, Peter. The answer is they're extremely constrained. And the question is that constraint, is that constraint deliberate? Is that constraint maybe a site of major political action, right?
Hmm.
We don't often talk, or some people do, I do, and I'm sure Ryan does too, and I'm sure you do, about, we often think about the infrastructures, the epistemologies, the practices, including coding, that produce the kind of inequitous and maybe violent systems that we have, or what are the issues that are going on. And so the answer that is that a series of decisions around the history of digital computing have built the systems that we have. And we know, for example, that if we were to actually have quantum computing, we would need a new programming language. It just couldn't be Boolean. If it were to actually program in quantum, not to be confused with the quantum computing we do have, which is like really fast computers that can do like lots more extra stuff, but essentially haven't changed the logic. And once you change the logic, you're also changing how you deal with time history. If I wasn't programmed linearly in linear algebra, obviously I would be in a totally different framework, just like if we thought about the way biological systems think or process, they have different structures, the way we represent the world really makes the world, and still programming in a certain sense is a form of representing, right, logic or processes or what have you. As much as we aspire to getting past representation, I would still say that, ingrained in that idea, our ideas of space and time, this follows that, and so on and so forth. And those things obviously highly delimit. Not only that, they constrain the types of data, the forms of experience, the types of empiricism. They can, like everything, right, has to be conformed into data that can be calculatable, can be used within those maths. So the bias is enormous there, as well as the limits to what kind of statistical model. Like, we're not doing, like, again, you're not in the realm of quanta, you're not doing statistical mechanics, you're doing stats, like 19th century stats, and those come with their whole, backload of normativity, race, sex, gender, etc.
Yeah, so, and they also come with the emergence of a way of, the taming of chance, to
absolutely,
to quote a
and
phrase.
Also, right, there's desires to manage risk and futurity in very limited ways. Now, in terms of the argument that there is indeed many mathematics that are much more complex, but we do not have programming languages for them.
Right.
So, but I think the issue there of that is our social preference and political and economic preferences that have come up through these ideological histories, maybe, or through the convergence of technology and ideology and economy and geopolitics and so many other things. So I don't want to give it too simple a veneer, but obviously we can do far more complex and different things, but it's going to take time, it's going to take money, it might not be applied in an immediate sense within an economy we already imagine. So one of the issues here is about the imaginary and how you produce, how do you move beyond the predictive, risk evaluative, how do you move beyond the logics of financialization when we produce technology. Those are things that, that's why we have to, I think we do, but I see an absolute mirror. Like I view non-applied mathematics and English as similarly humanistic and kind of non-functional things right now that I think are super worthy of doing, but we don't know what will happen with them. And so that's part of the question, is how do we break out of this kind of neoliberal financial model of technological development?
Yeah, that is really the point. I mean, we're sort of trapped into the previous technologies that were invested in at a certain time for certain geopolitical, socioeconomic reasons, historical reasons that particular chronotype that generated that, and the values that were ascribed at that particular time. But they're embedded and they become these deep layers that you can't then really extract, because they begin to, as our friend Marty Heidegger might say, begin to develop a technicity of their own, a momentum of their own that generates more unintended consequences, and you generate more technologies of the same to battle the same. So
yeah, I mean, I think you asked me earlier and I didn't answer well, and I don't know if I have an answer. And by the way, there are no answers.
there are no
to any
answers.
of
These are
this. This is
discussions.
just a conversation.
Yeah.
You asked about autonomy, and it's really interesting the way that neural networks as an idea also have an idea of kind of like the autonomous neuron that just
Right.
organizes, like that my brain is almost working without me, you know, like it's doing whatever, and that markets kind of somehow work out without people, like economics can be separated from politics or something like that. And no one really believes that. I don't really fully think, but I think the idea of an autonomous intelligence, but not necessarily a consciousness or subjectivity, is the other kind of inherence of these theories. And on one hand, it's really great because, you know, now, you know, mushrooms are smart and forests are smart and everything gets smart. But but it does pose certain questions about, you know, conscious decision making, representation, narrative, and these other questions of memory and history that are fundamentally, in many ways, I mean, many animals have memories, but virtually none can do history. And so, other than, and I'm not here to be anthropocentric or anything like that.
No,
but you know, these are certain questions that come up when we're talking about politics and enfranchisement and so on and so forth, as well as what we want to build into our machine systems. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that notion of autonomy and self-organization again throws us back to that Cold War moment of cybernetic leaning heavily on homeostasis as the state we want to achieve, because it's also undergirded by this idea of perpetual change in order to achieve this homeostasis within changing contextual conditions, right? So it's this push-pull. It's a stasis, but it's a stasis predicated upon change and development all the time. And so it is a really complex set of issues that technology has been deployed to address that is beyond its capacity to really do. Technology, at least in the way we're thinking of it here, because I would also say language is a technology and all kinds of other things are technologies as well. And that's what humans have. There's one final question here that we could look at. Can you see it?
Yeah, hi, Orit. This is from Svetlina Hristova. I hope I said your name right. I wonder if you want to speak about the focus on language and linguistic theories of the mind and how AI is developing today. The big focus on large language models. Link you make to neoliberalism and finance made me think of how Italian Marxists like Marazzi link language, communication, and finance as new logics of how capitalism operates. How much does language feature in these neurological theories of intelligence, and how important is this for how smartness is conceptualized? Excellent question. I have to say I'm not super familiar with Marazzi's work, so but I would, you know, from what you wrote, I would agree. But you know, the approach large language models are taking to language is not the approach that Minsky, like that people were taking in the 60s to language. I mean, there are similarities. I mean, all of these come out of these longer histories, Saussurian, et cetera, where we start to see language as a statistical pattern, as not necessarily that meaning can be separated from the actual, you know, utterance and that, you know, that signs are made up of these you know, assemblages, if you will. So people were starting to take language apart as a as a unified thing, and also beginning to find ways to analyze language in a lot of ways in a decontextualized, non-situated, ahistorical. Language wasn't about that, and also doing it within a fantasy, right, of translation as ceasing to become a problem in communication, increasingly trying to shift language, as we know, in the post-World War II milieu into an idea of information, that this is something datafiable, statistical, patterned. It's not imminent to what humans do or something like that.
Yeah, it's information separated from meaning. That Shannon's thing. Yeah.
Within these models, at least at the time periods I'm working, which is earlier, they're a lot like ChatGPT-4. Language has no particular specific power. People are looking at visual, they're looking at other senses. Hebb's original work was a lot about how people who have suffered injury in World War II compensate for lost perception or a lost limb, or any of these different things. So the actual problem of language doesn't really figure, as it doesn't. Well, it's with behavioralism in general. It's not a specific. Consciousness or your cognition. There's this whole movement really to split the brain from you, and that you see with a psychiatrization, and then later the kind of growth of neuroscience, which also sees itself. Hebb is considered one of the founders of neuroscience, and I do want to make one critical thing though. Hebb is not Hayek.
No.
And in many ways, I much like his ideas of the brain. Like, he has many, many complex ideas and is a quite situated, and, dealing with people in situations medically. There's a much more complex idea of the network there than maybe in the neoliberal formulation of the self-organizing kind of network decision maker. So I would, not that there's not a lot of complexity in Hayek, but I definitely don't. I also want to say that a lot of this is the convergence of many different forms of thinking that didn't have to converge, and that maybe we could still go back to and find more interesting models, because the parts of for example, the psychology that have never been realized as technology, like the kind of features that do become about consciousness, about how people still become themselves, because this was one of Hebb's issues that ended up being found out with soft torture. If people can get reprogrammed and fed fake information through their environment and then come to believe it, how do we all stay from being psychotic? Or maybe we are all now.
Maybe we are psychotic.
So, but these problems of psychosis, even as problems, were very, do demarcate these sciences. So I don't know if that helps, but I would say language itself as an imminent or meaningful or problem of translation or anything like that does not have a place in these theories, and that's not how they're treating it.
No, absolutely.
At least at the time.
And I think that call to discern the inheritances that we have from these traditions that are determining presentist modes of engagement and thinking, as well as fueling imaginaries for futures, is one of the key challenges. And that's the ethical move. That's the challenging ethical move, I think. All right, well, with that, Orit, thank you so very much. This has been grand. This has been really grand. I thank you so much.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll meet soon.
I hope so.
In live space as well.
Which would be really good.
Thank you all for,
Thanks,
and thank
everybody.
you all for coming.
And you can maybe use the little icon-y thing to clap. I'm going to clap. Right. So thank you so very much. Thanks a lot, Orit, and I'll be in touch. Take good care.
Okay, take care. Bye.